Hello everyone, I'm Yuan Gao from Beijing Normal University. The topic of my oral presentation is Objective Principles, Allocation Logic, and Framework Construction of Carbon Responsibility Accounts. Climate change has become an environmental issue of global concern. In climate change negotiations, common but differentiated responsibility is a common phrase that originated in the earlier 1970s. In 1974, polluter pays principle is proposed. It means that polluters such as countries, enterprises, and individuals should bear the responsibility for the pollution they cause to society and pay the costs. The essence of two principles is the producer responsibility. The production-based principle can lead to carbon leakage. So some researchers proposed consumption-based principle. It can solve the problem, but carbon responsibility embodied among trade is only transferred from the production side to the consumption side. There are also other principles, such as extraction-based allocation principle. People think emissions should be allocated to the essential producers who drive income from the extraction and sale of fossil fuels. Income-based allocation principle means that any participant in the supply chain can make money from polluting production processes should be responsible for the environment. Carbon emission responsibility allocation is the basis for identifying key emission subjects and clarifying carbon emission rights, and it is also an important link for rationally formulating carbon emission reduction policies and improving the carbon trading market system. Equity and efficiency are two commonly used principles in determining emission allocation. Researchers often define equity principles based on different indicators, single or composite, to construct methods for determining future emission reduction quotas, such as population, GDP, carbon emissions, and other indicators. In recent years, more and more scholars have paid attention to the efficiency principle of carbon emission quota allocation, which is more in line with the requirements of green economic development. Considering the complexity of reality, and in order to improve the acceptability of allocation, some researchers have tried to integrate the principles of equity and efficiency to allocate carbon emissions at different levels. At present, there are many different distribution principles and distribution mechanisms, but the truth is that no allocation option can fully cover all considerations. Our focus is on supply chain emissions. First, there is currently less focus on supply chain emissions. Secondly, studies have shown that an industry's direct emissions account for only 14% of the total carbon emissions of the supply chain on average, while direct emissions plus industry energy inputs account for only 26%. As a major player in economic activity, the change of carbon emission reduction of individual item price has little impact on the supply chain. In addition, most of the existing carbon emission responsibility accounting starts from the production of enterprises. As an important participant in the supply chain, the final consumer is the final service objective of all producers, and also plays an important role in carbon emission reduction and bears the responsibility of carbon emission reduction. Based on the existing domestic research, we propose to construct the framework of carbon responsibility account system based on supply chain. First, to determine the carbon emission baseline value of the product in the supply chain, that is, according to the average value of the carbon emission responsibility of the product in the supply chain to set. The mathematical expression is then the carbon emission responsibility sharing of all participants in the supply chain can be expressed by the following formula. That is, the carbon emission responsibility of product L produced by enterprise N in supply chain S is direct carbon emissions responsibility of enterprise N of supply chain S in the local production process, plus the carbon emission responsibility from the upstream of supply chain S to enterprise N, including the carbon emission responsibility embodied in the raw materials, electricity, heat, intermediate products, and others purchased by enterprise N, and then minus the carbon emission responsibility from enterprise N to the downstream of supply chain S, that is, the carbon emission responsibility embodied in the products sold by enterprise N. Specifically, this can be demonstrated through a simplified supply chain. One thing to note, the end consumer can be either people or enterprises. If people, the carbon emission responsibility is the carbon emission embodied by the products in the supply chain they consume. If enterprises, the carbon emission responsibility should also include the carbon emissions of the production process of the enterprises in the supply chain. The carbon emission responsibility allocation of each participant in the supply chain is shown in the table. Of course, this is just the simplest supply chain case. In fact, the supply chain is more complicated. There may be more than one enterprise in each link of the supply chain, and the supply chain may also involve overseas import or export. Therefore, the determination of carbon emission baseline value for supply chain products will be more complicated. So there are many scenarios that we are still exploring further. That's my presentation. Thank you.